Ever watch a movie and see a knight in shining armor moving like a rusty robot? They struggle to get up, can barely walk, and need a crane just to get on a horse. It makes for good drama, but what if I told you that's almost completely wrong? The reality of medieval armor is so much cooler and more advanced than Hollywood gives it credit for. Forget the idea of knights being slow, clumsy tanks. Today, we're busting that myth wide open and revealing the incredible engineering behind these historical battlesuits. So, how much did a full suit of plate armor actually weigh? You might be thinking 100 kilograms or more, right? The surprising answer is only about 20 to 25 kilograms. That's less than what a modern soldier carries in their backpack. And here's the brilliant part, that weight wasn't just hanging off their shoulders. It was expertly distributed all over the body, from head to toe. This meant it didn't feel like carrying a heavy load. It felt more like wearing a second skin, a protective exoskeleton that moved with them. This incredible design allowed for a surprising range of motion. A knight in full plate could do pretty much everything you could do without it. They could run, jump, and even do a somersault. Historical records and training manuals show knights practicing wrestling, climbing ladders, and quickly mounting their horses without any help. There are even accounts of knights performing acrobatic feats to show off their agility and the quality of their armor. They weren't just walking fortresses. They were highly athletic warriors. The armor was custom-fitted to the individual, like a tailored suit, ensuring maximum mobility. Each plate was articulated, meaning it was connected by rivets and leather straps in a way that allowed the joints to bend and move freely. Your elbow, knee, and shoulder could move almost as if there was nothing there. Now, let's talk protection. This is where medieval armor truly shines. It was designed to make a knight nearly invincible against the common weapons of the day, a sword slash. It would likely just glance off the curved steel plates without leaving more than a scratch. Arrows? Unless it was a direct hit from a powerful longbow at close range into a weak spot, an arrow would often bounce right off. Even heavy blows from weapons like maces or warhammers had their force significantly reduced, turning a potentially fatal strike into a survivable, albeit painful, bruise. This level of protection gave knights immense confidence on the battlefield. They could charge into the fray knowing they were shielded from most attacks, allowing them to focus on their own offense. So why does the myth of clumsy knights persist? Part of it comes from later periods when jousting armor, which was much heavier and more specialized, became common. This tournament armor was not meant for battlefield mobility. Its sole purpose was to protect a rider from a lance impact in a controlled environment. But for centuries, battlefield armor was the pinnacle of personal protective technology. It was a perfect balance of weight, mobility, and defense, created by master craftsmen who understood human anatomy and material science better than we often realize. The next time you see a knight struggling on screen, remember the truth. These warriors were not trapped in metal prisons. They were elite athletes wearing cutting-edge technology that allowed them to dominate the medieval battlefield with both strength and incredible agility. It just goes to show that sometimes history is even more amazing than fiction. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed uncovering this piece of history, be sure to like this video and subscribe for more myth-busting content. See you next time. Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. If you've ever watched a movie about knights in shining armor, you've probably seen them swinging massive swords around, cutting down enemies left and right. It looks epic, right? But what if I told you that almost everything Hollywood shows us about medieval sword fighting is, well, pretty much wrong? Today, we're going to unsheathe the truth and explore what real medieval combat was actually like. Spoiler alert, the sword wasn't the king of the battlefield. So let's set the scene. Imagine a chaotic, muddy field filled with hundreds of soldiers clashing in heavy armor. In the movies, this is where our hero, armed with just a sword, wades into the fray. But in reality, a knight going into battle with only a sword would be like a modern soldier bringing only a pistol to a rifle fight. It's a backup, a last resort. The real primary weapons of the medieval battlefield were long, powerful, and designed for one thing: reach. We're talking about spears, lances, and especially the terrifying poleaxe. Think about it logically. If your enemy is 10 feet away and has a long spear, and you have a 3-foot sword, who has the advantage? The spearman, every single time. Long weapons allowed soldiers to keep their enemies at a distance, to strike from a safer position, and to break up enemy formations. A wall of spearmen was one of the most effective tactical units of the era. Knights on horseback would use lances to deliver devastating charges, shattering enemy lines before the close-quarters fighting even began. The sword only came out when those primary weapons broke, were dropped, or when the fighting got so dense and chaotic that a long polearm became too clumsy to use effectively. It was a sidearm, not the main event. Now let's talk about what happened when swords were drawn, especially in a one-on-one duel between two fully armored knights. Forget the wide, flashy slashes you see in films. A full suit of plate armor was incredibly effective at deflecting cuts. Slashing at a steel breastplate with a sword would do little more than scratch the paint and maybe tire you out. It was like trying to open a can with a butter knife. So what did they do instead? They aimed for the gaps. Real sword combat against an armored opponent was all about precision. It was a deadly game of finding the weak points, the joints at the elbows, the armpits, the groin, the visor of the helmet. The goal wasn't to cut, but to thrust. To achieve this, knights used a fascinating technique called half-swording. This meant gripping the blade itself with their free hand, usually gloved, to turn the sword into a short, stiff spear. This gave them incredible point control, allowing them to guide the tip precisely into an opponent's vulnerable gaps. It looks strange to us now, holding a sharp blade, but it was one of the most effective ways to defeat armor. It was less like a swashbuckling fight and more like a high-stakes, violent form of fencing. But the sword wasn't just a pointy stick. It was also a tool for grappling. Medieval combat manuals, the actual fight books written by masters of the time, are filled with techniques for wrestling and takedowns. Knights would use the crossguard of their sword to hook an opponent's leg, trip them, or wrench their weapon away. They used the pommel, the weighted knob at the end of the hilt, to smash into an enemy's faceplate. The sword became an extension of their body, used to push, pull, and unbalance the enemy to create an opening for that final, lethal thrust. It was a dirty, brutal, and highly technical affair, a far cry from the elegant dance we often imagine. Of course, the sword's role changed depending on the situation. Against an unarmored opponent, like a lightly equipped archer or a peasant levy, cutting was much more effective. A sharp blade could inflict horrific wounds on unprotected flesh. But the primary adversaries for a knight were other knights, and against them, the sword was a specialized tool for a specific job. Its legendary status comes more from its role as a personal sidearm, a symbol of status, and knighthood, and a weapon for civilian duels rather than its dominance on the battlefield. So, the next time you see a movie knight single-handedly defeating an army with just his trusty sword, you can appreciate the spectacle, but you'll know the reality was far more complex and, frankly, a lot more interesting. The true art of medieval combat was about using the right tool for the job. And more often than not, that tool was long, pointy, and definitely not just a sword. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive into a bit of historical myth-busting. If you enjoyed this and want to see more content that separates fact from fiction, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Let me know in the comments what other historical myths you'd like me to tackle next. Until then, stay curious. Ever wondered how ancient armies marched through a hail of arrows and still won the day? We often see shields in movies as these simple, passive hunks of wood or metal, just there to block a sword swing. But the reality is so much more exciting. Shields weren't just for defense. They were the secret weapon that shaped entire battles. They were complex, versatile tools that defined how wars were fought for thousands of years. From the tight formations of Roman legions to the duels of medieval knights, the humble shield was a true game-changer. So, let's pull back the curtain on Hollywood portrayals and dive into the real, tactical genius of the shield. Imagine you're a soldier inching across an open field. The sky darkens as 1,000 enemy arrows begin their descent. This is where the shield isn't just a lifesaver, it's a key to victory. Large shields, like the Roman scutum or the Viking round shield, allowed entire formations to advance under heavy projectile fire, creating a mobile roof of protection. This let armies close the distance with the enemy while taking minimal casualties. Without this ability to safely traverse the kill zone, many famous historical advances would have been impossible. It turned a suicidal charge into a calculated, protected assault. So next time you see a movie army just running through arrow fire, remember that in reality their shields were the technology that made it all possible. Once the lines met and the chaotic melee began, the shield's role became even more critical. It was the foundation of a stable defensive line. Soldiers would lock their shields together, creating a solid wall of wood and steel. This wasn't just about stopping individual attacks. It was about holding ground against the immense pressure of an enemy charge. A well-maintained shield line could absorb the shock of a cavalry charge or an infantry push, preventing the formation from breaking. A broken formation meant chaos, individual combat, and usually a swift defeat. The shield was the glue that held the army together, turning a mob of individuals into a unified, resilient fighting force that could push, hold, and dominate the battlefield. But here's something movies almost never get right. Shields were fantastic offensive weapons. You didn't just hide behind it. You fought with it. The hard rim of a shield was perfect for a powerful bash to an opponent's face, staggering them or even breaking their jaw. The central metal boss wasn't just for reinforcement. It was a heavy, concentrated point of impact, essentially a fist of steel. You could punch with it to create an opening or use the edge to hook your opponent's own shield, pulling it aside to expose them for a quick strike with your sword or spear. It was a constant, aggressive part of your combat style, used to disorient, control, and create opportunities. A warrior who only blocked with their shield was a warrior who was probably going to lose. For a duelist, like a medieval knight, the shield was a masterclass in controlling the fight. In a one-on-one encounter, managing distance is everything. The shield allowed a knight to safely close the gap, pressure an opponent, or create space to recover. It was an extension of their body, constantly moving to parry, deflect, and angle attacks away. Crucially, it protected their weapon hand and arm, their primary means of attack. Losing the ability to wield your sword meant you were finished. The shield ensured that your most valuable asset remained safe while you looked for that perfect moment to strike. It was a dynamic dance of offense and defense, with the shield leading the steps. Perhaps the most iconic use of shields in formation is the legendary shield wall. Popularized by Vikings and Saxons, this tactic involves soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder, overlapping their shields to create a nearly impenetrable barrier. This wasn't just a static wall. It was a living, breathing entity. The front ranks would absorb the attack while the ranks behind them could offer support, thrust with spears over the top, and quickly step in to replace any fallen comrades. A well-drilled shield wall could grind down a superior force, making frontal assaults incredibly costly for the attacker. It required immense discipline, trust, and coordination, proving that the strength of many shields working together was far greater than the sum of their parts. The shield wall shows that in ancient warfare, teamwork, structured by the shield, was the ultimate weapon. So the next time you see a shield in a fantasy epic or a historical drama, look closer. It's not just a passive accessory. It's a tactical tool that enabled advances, a weapon that could stun and strike, a personal bodyguard in a duel, and the cornerstone of legendary formations. The shield was a multi-purpose instrument of war that offered protection, created structure, and provided a decisive tactical advantage. It's a testament to the ingenuity of ancient warriors and a piece of history far more dynamic than we often give it credit for. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this deep dive, don't forget to subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more. See you next time. Let's start with the most basic yet most effective weapon of all time, the spear. A wall of spears was a nightmare for charging cavalry and a solid defense against infantry. Does he draw his sword then? Maybe, but if he was serious about fighting other armored opponents, he'd reach for something far more brutal, the poleaxe. It's a 6-foot pole with a multi-purpose weapon head. Some poleaxes even had a small hook, called a bec de corbin or crow's beak, which was great for hooking an opponent's shield, leg, or weapon to pull them off balance. So why were these polearms so much better than swords against armor? It's all about physics. A sword is great for cutting unarmored targets, but against a solid steel plate, it's mostly useless. You can't generate enough force with a one-handed swing. A polearm, on the other hand, is a lever. You use both hands, put in your entire body weight behind a swing with a heavy weapon head at the end of a long shaft. The amount of force delivered is immense. A poleaxe blow could crumple a breastplate. A halberd could split a helmet. These weren't elegant weapons. They were tools designed for one purpose: to defeat armor. They had reach, they had power, and they had versatility. So next time you see a fantasy hero charging into battle, picture them with a poleaxe instead of a sword. Have you ever watched a movie and seen knights just wildly charging into a giant mob of soldiers? It looks epic, right? All chaos, horses crashing, and individual heroes pulling off impossible feats. Well, what if I told you that Hollywood gets it almost completely wrong? The reality of medieval cavalry charges was far more disciplined, strategic, and honestly, even more impressive than what we see on screen. Let's start by breaking down the Hollywood myth. In films, a cavalry charge often looks like a free-for-all. A handful of knights on horseback just gallop at full speed, scattering an entire army like bowling pins. They seem to rely on pure momentum and individual skill, weaving through enemies and fighting in isolation. It makes for great drama, but in a real battle, a knight who did that would be a dead knight, very, very quickly. A lone rider, no matter how skilled, would be surrounded, pulled from his horse, and overwhelmed in seconds. The truth is that mounted combat was one of the most organized and precise tactics of medieval warfare. Think of a medieval cavalry unit less like a stampede and more like a finely tuned, heavily armored spearhead. The key to their effectiveness wasn't chaos, it was control. Knights didn't just charge randomly. They rode in tight, disciplined formations. One of the most common was the N-high, a long line formation, or a wedge designed to punch through enemy lines at a specific point. These formations required incredible skill and endless hours of practice. The goal was to maintain cohesion. The knights would ride knee, creating a solid wall of steel and horseflesh. This concentration of force was terrifying and devastating. When this formation hit an infantry line, the combined impact was immense. It wasn't just one horse hitting one person. It was the synchronized shock of dozens of lances striking at the same moment. Backed by the weight of armored men and powerful war horses, this focused impact could shatter shields, pierce armor, and break the morale of even the most steadfast infantry. And what about the horses? Hollywood often portrays them as simple tools, but war horses were highly trained, specialized animals. They weren't just any old farm horse. Destriers, the most prized war horses, were bred for strength, courage, and stamina. They were trained for years to remain calm amidst the deafening noise and chaos of battle, to charge in a straight line without shying away, and to respond to subtle leg and rein commands. The knight and his horse operated as a single, seamless fighting unit. This synergy was the result of a lifetime of training for both rider and mount. The charge itself was a carefully timed maneuver. It wasn't a desperate, all-out sprint from a mile away. That would exhaust the horses before they even reached the enemy. Instead, the charge would begin at a walk, then build to a trot, and only accelerate to a full gallop in the final 100 yards or so. This conserved the horses' energy, ensuring they had maximum power at the moment of impact. The sound of hundreds of armored horses thundering towards you, building speed, must have been psychologically crushing. So, what happened after the initial collision? The lances were single-use weapons in a charge. Once they made contact, they would often shatter or become embedded, making them useless for the ensuing melee. This is where the knight's versatility came into play. The knights would drop their broken lances and immediately switch to their secondary, one-handed weapons. These could be swords, maces, or warhammers, which were perfect for close-quarters combat from horseback. The fight would then transform from a coordinated charge into a swirling series of individual and small group skirmishes, but the knights still relied on teamwork. They would protect each other's flanks and work together to exploit weaknesses in the now disrupted enemy formation. The idea wasn't just to plow through and keep going. Often the cavalry would charge, break the line, and then wheel around to regroup and charge again from the flank or rear. This required even more discipline and communication. So, the next time you see a movie with a wild, chaotic cavalry charge, remember the reality. It wasn't about reckless solo heroism. It was about teamwork, precision, and incredible discipline. Real medieval knights were part of a highly effective military machine, where the power of the group, moving as one, was far greater than any single warrior. It was a brutal, calculated, and terrifyingly effective tactic that dominated the battlefields of Europe for centuries. Thanks so much for watching. If you found this interesting and want to debunk more historical myths, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more content. See you in the next one. These weren't just side skills, they were the core of armored combat. Knights were expert grapplers. The primary goal wasn't to land a clean sword strike, but to control your opponent's body. It was all about leverage, balance, and using their own weight and armor against them. Imagine two walking tanks trying to knock each other over. They would grab each other, clinch, and wrestle for a dominant position. They'd try to trip their opponent, throw them off balance, and get them on the ground. Once a knight was on the ground, his armor became a huge disadvantage. It was heavy, cumbersome, and made it incredibly difficult to get back up, especially with another armored man on top of you. Being on your back in a full suit of armor was practically a death sentence. This is where the fight gets really up close and personal. Once the opponent was down or pinned, the attacking knight wouldn't try to hack through the armor. These were places like the visor slits of the helmet, the armpits, the joints at the elbows and knees, or the groin area. It was a brutal and methodical process of finding an opening and ending the fight. So, real armored combat was this intense, messy blend of wrestling and targeted weapon fighting. It was about overpowering your opponent, taking them to the ground, and then finishing them with a dagger. It was far from the clean, theatrical sword duels we see in Hollywood. Instead of fancy footwork and parries, it was about brute strength, grappling skill, and knowing the weak points of the armor. It was a gritty, exhausting, and incredibly dangerous business. It really makes you appreciate the skill and sheer toughness of these medieval warriors in a completely new way. It wasn't just about swinging a sword. It was about total combat domination. Next time you see a knight fight in a movie, you'll know the real secret to their success wasn't just the sword in their hand, but their ability to wrestle their opponent into the dirt. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this deep dive into historical combat, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more. Hollywood loves to show us epic medieval battles, right? A lone, shining knight, sword swinging, taking on a whole army by himself. It looks amazing on screen, but let's talk about how real battles actually went down. Spoiler alert, it was nothing like the movies, the biggest difference. Knights never ever fought alone. That heroic one-man army thing is pure fantasy. In reality, a knight who tried that would be a dead knight in about 30 seconds. So what was the truth? It was all about teamwork, strategy, and formations. Think of a medieval army less like a collection of individual fighters and more like a well-oiled, deadly machine. The most fundamental tactic was the shield wall. Soldiers, including knights who fought on foot, would lock their shields together, creating an almost impenetrable barrier. It was a moving fortress of wood and steel, designed to absorb enemy attacks and protect the men behind it. Forget flashy sword fights. This was about discipline, endurance, and holding the line at all costs. Then you have the spear blocks or pike formations. Imagine hundreds, sometimes thousands of soldiers armed with incredibly long spears, all pointing forward. It was like a giant, angry hedgehog trying to charge a horse into that. It would be suicide for both the rider and the horse. These formations were the ultimate defense against cavalry, stopping a charge dead in its tracks and creating a zone of control on the battlefield that was nearly impossible to break through. This is where the knights on horseback, the classic image we all have, came into play. But they didn't just randomly charge in. Their attacks were carefully timed and coordinated. They were the elite shock troops, the medieval equivalent of a tank. A commander would hold them in reserve, waiting for the perfect moment. Maybe the enemy's infantry line was starting to get tired, or a gap opened up in their formation. That's when the signal would be given. A coordinated cavalry charge was a terrifying sight. The ground would shake as hundreds of armored men and horses thundered across the field. Their goal wasn't to fight a dozen enemies at once, but to hit a specific weak point in the enemy line with overwhelming force. The sheer impact was designed to shatter formations, cause panic, and break the enemy's morale. Once the line was broken, the battle would shift dramatically, allowing the rest of the army to pour through the gap. Knights were the tip of the spear, but the spear itself was the entire army working together. Even the infantry didn't just run around chaotically. They were organized into structured lines and units, each with a specific role. Archers would rain down arrows to soften up the enemy before the main engagement. Crossbowmen provided powerful, armor-piercing shots. The infantrymen with swords and axes were there to hold the line or exploit any breaks the cavalry created. Every single person had a job, and success depended on everyone doing their part in a coordinated way. Flanking maneuvers were also a huge part of medieval tactics. Why attack the strongest part of an enemy's formation, like their shield wall, head-on? A smart commander would try to maneuver his troops around the side or even the back of the enemy army. A successful flank attack could completely collapse an enemy line, turning an orderly battle into a chaotic rout. This required immense discipline and communication, often using flags and horns to give orders across a noisy, confusing battlefield. So where does our heroic knight fit into this big picture? They were the leaders, the heavy hitters, the game changers. But they were always part of a system. A knight's value wasn't just in his personal fighting skill, but in his ability to lead his men, to hold his place in the formation, and to execute a charge at precisely the right moment. They were highly trained, expensive, and valuable assets that no commander would waste on a reckless solo mission. The next time you watch a movie and see a knight single-handedly defeating 50 opponents, just remember the reality. Real medieval warfare was a brutal, strategic chess game played with human pieces. It was about formations, discipline, and the combined power of an entire army working as one. The true heroism wasn't in the flashy duels, but in the courage to stand shoulder to shoulder with your comrades, hold the line, and trust in the plan. It's a different kind of epic, but in my opinion, it's far more fascinating. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this look into real history, be sure to like and subscribe for more. See you next time.